Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the news that the amendment to Boris Johnson's emergency COVID powers cannot be debated and voted on, leaving Johnson able to carry on making up laws as he sees fit, potentially against the will of Parliament. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So when Parliament gave Boris Johnson his emergency COVID powers back in March, they still expected to be notified of measures to be taken. However, what happened in reality is that Johnson and his government have shown Parliament, including their own backbenchers, complete disregard. And it's not just that they were coming up with new measures without involving Parliament. Of course, that is what should offend most of us. The emergency powers were specifically voted for them to be allowed to come up with measures quickly, sort of bypassing Parliament. You know, you've got to be able to act quickly in a fast-changing emergency situation without getting bogged down in committee. People understood that. That's why people supported it. However, announcements about the measures should still have been made to Parliament. Ministers should have been announcing these things to Parliament, but they weren't. Ministers would announce them in live broadcasts, or even just to journalists, off the record potentially sometimes, or at press briefings. In addition, the measures were often confused and confusing, and new criminal offences were being created hours, sometimes even minutes, literally minutes before they came into force, giving nobody the opportunity to become familiar with them. And MPs were, of course, not at all happy. More important for Boris Johnson, Conservative MPs were not at all happy. And let's not misunderstand here. They don't get to claim that their unhappiness is because of the sovereignty of Parliament, and of course Parliament must have a say and you must come to Parliament and you can't ignore us. They've all voted multiple times this year to cede power to Boris Johnson over various things, mostly related to Brexit. Now, the main reason that those Conservative MPs are unhappy is fundamentally because they do not like his rules. They don't like his U-turns. And they don't like being caught out by sudden announcements before they've had time to work out how best to spin it to their advantage in their own constituencies. So with the emergency powers coming up for review, which have now come and gone for review, they plan to clip his wings. So senior backbench MP Sir Graham Brady proposed an amendment to their regulations, which would mean that ministers would have to seek approval from Parliament for new measures put in place. So the idea is ministers would come up with some new measure. They could do it quickly still, but then they'd have to go to Parliament for a vote on it. And if Parliament voted against it, then retroactively it'd be removed. Labour were also going to back this amendment as well. Now, that meant if the amendment was debated on and voted for, it would have succeeded. Boris Johnson would be defeated on this one. There were, as well as opposition MPs who would have voted for it, there were plenty of Conservative MPs going for it. And it would have forced Boris Johnson to have very actively and formally involve Parliament in his decisions. However, the Speaker of the House, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, didn't select it. So what happens is when amendments come up, the Speaker decides which ones should be selected for a debate and a vote, because otherwise MPs will come up all the time. You have to have some process of selection. Now, there's various criteria for selecting it. Mostly it takes the form of, is there enough support in the House for this to be a realistic prospect? You don't obviously support amendments where you know there's no real support for it. Now, that wouldn't be the case here. There was overwhelming support for it. So the reason why he didn't select the amendment is because the amendment itself was, in his terms, legally confusing. He didn't block it as such. So what happened was at the start of the week, because I didn't know, I was just looking forward to this, and then some experts started to sort of say that, well, the amendment probably wouldn't be selected because it makes no sense. Because the purpose of the renewal vote is a yes or no question. It is, because the whole purpose of this vote this motion coming before Parliament is, should Boris Johnson's government get another 6 month extension to these emergency powers? Yes or no? And the purpose of the amendment was to make it, as one commentator put it, a yes, but. And indeed, Hoyle, as I said, cited legal uncertainty over this as his reason for not selecting it. So it is accepted by experts that there was no way he could accept it. He's not blocking anything. The reason, simply put, is that the emergency powers are being used by the government to enact new legislation by what are called statutory instruments. They're not supposed to use statutory instruments in this way. They're supposed to be used not to create laws, but to tidy existing laws up. But the government are using them as a form of rule by decree. You know, they are behaving very much as a dictatorship. And the problem is, though, that there is no sensible legal way to amend this act to force the government to seek parliamentary approval for statutory instruments, because that's not how they work. As the Speaker said, like I said it 3 times now, wouldn't make legal sense. So Parliament's choice was as follows. It would have liked the amendment, absolutely, but it couldn't get that. So its choice was either you rubber stamp these emergency powers for another 6 months and let Boris Johnson carry on, or you refuse to authorise the extension. Now, of course, they had to allow the extension. They had to. The bottom line is that we are in the middle of an emergency, and that emergency requires emergency powers. It requires very fast action. Parliament cannot afford to withdraw these measures, and the government knows it. Yes, the government are extending and deepening the emergency through their cack-handed handling of the situation, you know, but nobody can deny that there is an emergency. And I know it's a problem because the government will now see political advantage, if it didn't already, in extending the emergency so it can extend its use of these powers, which it quite enjoys. It likes making up laws without having to go through the bothersome process of discussing it with Parliament. But there it is. We are in an emergency. No one seriously doubts we're in an emergency. Unless, of course, you spend all your time being educated by Russian bots on the internet. And there are plenty of those. Now, MPs had to extend the emergency powers. They did extend the emergency powers. Otherwise, of course, it would be impossible to implement the piss-poor, disjointed measures that the government are putting in place in a vague attempt to have some sort of impact on the infection rate rises. But as piss-poor as those measures are, they are still better than nothing. That doesn't mean backbenchers can't do anything, though. It doesn't mean they're completely screwed. They can threaten to disrupt non-emergency government business. And, you know, if he and his ministers don't start behaving. They could also threaten the nuclear option of a change of leadership in an extreme case. Now, there doesn't seem to be any of this happening overtly right now. But that being said, ministers have promised to be a bit more considerate. So that does suggest that enough backbenchers have put enough pressure on the government to say, look, we're going to let you carry on with these powers, but don't take the piss. So one idea that's been reported is for the ability for Parliament to retroactively vote on measures within a week of them being enacted. So what would happen is the government would still get to come up with these measures quickly, still get to act quickly, put things in place. The laws would still be put in place. But then Parliament within a week would get to debate them, and if they didn't like them, they could vote them down. Now, to my mind, that could cause even more uncertainty because the government, they announce a restriction one day, but then Parliament remove it a week later, then there may be some second guessing going on. If you start to see reports in the media that might be overblown, because remember, a lot of the right-wing media, not in favour of any measures, they may give the impression that those measures are going to be voted down by MPs, at which point some people may say, well, there's no point in obeying them right now, especially if they think they can get away with it. So you could add an extra layer of confusion there. But I suppose there's already plenty of confusion going on right now. Would it really be that much more? Johnson's also promised to make more regular updates to Parliament and then allow MPs to question his scientific advisors more frequently as well. Again, we'll have to see how that works in practice, I guess. And coming back to the Speaker. So, although Hoyle made a statement explaining why he could not select the amendment for a vote, he didn't just not select it, he did explain to MPs because it did have popular support. So he stood up and he gave his explanation. He did also tear a strip off the government for their disgraceful behaviour. And he also said that he would give, and I quote, sympathetic consideration to applications for urgent questions or emergency debates in such cases. Now, what that means is if the government continue taking the piss, He will allow MPs to demand that ministers come to the House urgently to explain their latest piece of nonsense. So, you know, if they're not going to go through Parliament, if they're not going to make announcements to Parliament, he will force them to come to Parliament and give an account of themselves and answer questions of MPs. So they won't be allowed to continue hiding away from both Parliament and the public. But that is the situation there. Boris Johnson gets another 6 months of being king. Well, assuming his leadership can last another 6 months, that is. But I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.